I've worked the late shift at the diner for almost 3 years now. It's a quiet, small-town place, open 24 hours. But after 11 p.m., there's barely anyone who comes in. Most of the regulars are truckers passing through, or locals who just want coffee while they wait for their laundry to finish at the 24-hour laundromat across the street. It's not a bad gig, just boring mostly, until a few weeks ago. I've been trying to wrap my head around what happened that night, but the more I think about it, the more it messes with me. It's not that something supernatural happened or anything, but it's the feeling that I could have done something, or that maybe I missed some kind of signal. But, let me start from the beginning. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, dead quiet. The radio behind the counter was playing some old country music softly, and the only sound was the hum of the coffee machine. I had one customer, an older guy sitting in the corner nursing his cup of black coffee. He was a regular, always came in after his late shift at the gas station down the road, so I didn't pay him much attention. The bell above the door jingled, and I looked up. A guy walked in. He was in his mid-30s maybe, wearing a worn-out hoodie and jeans. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were wide and darting around the diner like he was expecting someone to jump out at him. It was weird, but hey, we get all kinds in here. He sat down in one of the booths near the window, far from the older guy in the corner. I walked over with a menu, but he didn't even look at it. His eyes flicked up at me, and for a second I felt uneasy. There was something in his stare, like desperation mixed with fear. "I'll have a coffee," he said, his voice low. I nodded, and went back to the counter, poured him a fresh cup, and set it down in front of him. He didn't touch it, just stared out the window like he was waiting for someone. "Anything else?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He shook his head, then changed his mind. "Actually, eggs, scrambled, toast, sure thing." I gave him a small smile, but he didn't seem to notice. I went back to the kitchen and told the cook, Jerry, about the order. While Jerry worked on the eggs, I kept glancing at the guy. He hadn't moved. His hands were clasped together on the table and his foot was tapping nervously. Something about him just felt off. When I brought his food out, he didn't touch it. He just stared at the plate like he couldn't figure out what to do with it. I watched him for a second, feeling like maybe I should ask if he was okay, but I didn't want to make it weird. People come in here looking exhausted or anxious all the time. Truckers, drifters, you name it. You get used to it. I went back to cleaning the counter, but I could feel his eyes on me. After a few minutes I looked over and he was standing by the door looking like he was about to leave. "Hey, you didn't eat," I said, motioning to the untouched food. He looked at the plate, then back at me. His face was pale, and there was a strange intensity in his eyes. "Look man," he said quietly, stepping closer, "if anyone asks about me, you didn't see me, okay?" I blinked, not sure if I heard him right. "What? If anyone comes in here asking about me, you say you didn't see me, got it?" I stared at him, confused. Sure. Okay." He gave me one last look, nodded, and then walked out of the diner. The bell above the door jingled again, and just like that, he was gone. I stood there for a minute, wondering what the hell just happened. People say strange things all the time, especially late at night, but something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. The older guy in the corner hadn't even noticed. He was still sipping his coffee, staring at the newspaper spread out in front of him. I shrugged it off and went back to wiping down tables. Not 10 minutes later, 2 men came in. They weren't regulars, and they didn't look like the usual truckers or locals. Both were dressed in dark suits, which was odd for this time of night. They looked around the diner before one of them walked up to the counter. "Evening," the man said, his voice smooth but firm. "We're looking for someone. A man, mid-30s, wearing a hoodie. He would have come in not too long ago. Did you see anyone like that?" I froze. My heart started racing as I remembered the guy's warning. I looked at the man standing in front of me, then over at his partner, who was casually scanning the booths. Something about them felt wrong, like they weren't cops, but they had authority. "Nah, haven't seen anyone like that," I lied, my voice sounding shaky in my own ears. The man stared at me for a few seconds, his eyes narrowing like he didn't believe me, but then he smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "All right," he said, "thanks for your time." They both walked out without another word, leaving me standing there feeling like I'd just dodged a bullet. I didn't know what those guys were after, but I knew I didn't want to get involved. The rest of my shift passed by in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the guy, about his cryptic warning. I wondered who he was and what he'd gotten himself into, but the more I thought about it, the more I just wanted to forget the whole thing. The next few days were normal, or as normal as things get in a small-town diner. I didn't see the strange man again, and the 2 guys in suits didn't come back. I figured maybe it was just a weird encounter and tried to put it behind me. Then, about a week later, I saw his face again, on the news. It was one of those local broadcasts, the kind they play in the diner during the morning rush. I was refilling a customer's coffee when I glanced up at the screen. There, plastered across the TV, was a mugshot of the guy from that night, the same guy who'd told me to pretend I hadn't seen him. The headline read, "Man found dead near abandoned warehouse." My stomach dropped. I set the coffee pot down, staring at the screen. The news anchor was talking about how the man's body had been discovered just outside of town, near an old warehouse that hadn't been used in years. No cause of death had been released, but police were treating it as suspicious. The customer I'd been serving glanced at the TV, then back at me. "You all right?" I muttered something about needing a minute and walked into the back room. My hands were shaking. The guy was dead. I didn't know him, but I felt like I was somehow involved, like maybe if I'd done something differently, he wouldn't have ended up like that. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, barely getting through my shift. When I got home that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying that night over and over in my head, wondering what he'd been running from, who those guys in suits were and what they really wanted. And the worst part is, I keep thinking about what he said. If they ask, "You didn't see me." Why did he pick me? Did he think I could help him, or was I just some random guy working the graveyard shift? And who were those men that came looking for him? Were they after him for something he'd done, or was he running from something worse? I still don't have any answers, and I don't think I ever will. All I know is that I'll never forget that night. Every time I hear the bell above the door jingle, I get this tight feeling in my chest, like I'm expecting someone to walk in with another cryptic warning, leaving me with more questions than answers. I don't know what really happened to that guy, but part of me is glad I'll never find out. I used to have this routine. Every Friday night after a long week of working late, I'd stop by this old diner on my way home. It wasn't fancy, and honestly the food was never that great, but it was open 24 hours, and I always had the place to myself at that hour. It was comforting in a weird way, just me, the cook, and sometimes an old guy who sat in the corner drinking black coffee like it was all he needed to survive. So, last Friday, I was on my way there. It was a little after midnight, and I was craving one of their greasy burgers and maybe a slice of pie if they had any left. I hadn't been in a couple of weeks, not since I took on more hours at work. But as I turned onto the street, I got this weird feeling. It's hard to explain, but something felt off. The diner looked the same from the outside. Flickering neon sign, half the letters burnt out. The usual parking lot with a few cars scattered around, nothing too strange. But when I walked inside, things felt different right away. First, the usual waitress wasn't there. She was always working this shift, and we'd chat sometimes. But tonight, there was a new guy behind the counter. He was tall, maybe in his mid-40s, with a long, greasy ponytail and an apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes barely flicked up when I walked in, like he didn't care that I was there. I almost turned around and left right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. People take nights off. New staff gets hired. It's not a big deal. I sat down at my usual booth, the one near the window where I could watch the road. I figured I'd give the guy a minute to come over and take my order, but he didn't. He just stood behind the counter, staring at something in the kitchen. I started to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be rude. So I got up and walked over to the counter to place my order directly. "Hey, can I get a burger and fries?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned his head slowly, like he didn't really want to look at me. His eyes were dark, almost too dark, like there was something off about them. "Yeah," he muttered, barely above a whisper, "that's it. No smile, no sure thing, no normal diner banter, just a cold, quiet yeah." I went back to my booth, and that's when I noticed something strange. The other customers, there were maybe 3 or 4 of them, all sitting in different booths, were completely silent. They weren't talking to each other, not even on their phones. They just sat there staring at their food. And the food, it didn't look right. It was all cold, like it had been sitting out for hours, untouched. I shifted in my seat, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe they were just tired, maybe they didn't feel like talking, but something about it didn't sit right with me. After what felt like way too long, the cook brought out my burger. He didn't even use a tray, just slapped the plate down on the table in front of me and walked away without a word. I looked down at the burger and my stomach turned. It was cold. Not just lukewarm, but ice cold, like it had come straight out of the fridge. The fries were soggy, like they'd been left in a puddle of grease for hours. I picked up the burger, but I couldn't bring myself to take a bite. Something about it just felt wrong. The smell, the texture, the way it looked like it had been prepared days ago. It was all wrong. I glanced around the diner again. The other customers still hadn't touched their food. They were just sitting there staring blankly at their plates. One guy in particular caught my eye. He was sitting in the booth across from mine, an older guy, maybe in his 60s. His eyes were wide open, unblinking, just staring at his cold, uneaten food. I thought about saying something, maybe asking if he was okay, but my gut told me to stay quiet. I pushed the plate away, feeling sick to my stomach. I stood up, threw a couple of bills on the table, and headed for the door. I didn't even care that I hadn't eaten. I just wanted to get out of there. As I reached the door, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. It was so soft, I almost didn't notice it. I turned around and for the briefest moment I saw the old guy across from me slowly turning his head in my direction. His eyes were still wide open, still unblinking, but now they were locked onto me. His mouth opened slightly like he was about to say something, but no words came out. That was enough for me. I bolted out of the diner, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped into my car and sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. When I got home, I sat in my car for a while trying to process what had just happened. It was just a diner, right? Just a bad meal, some weird customers, a new cook who didn't know what he was doing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The next day, I decided to look up the diner online. I don't even know why. Maybe I was trying to make sense of the weird feeling I had. I typed in the name of the diner and scrolled through the results, and that's when I saw it. A news article dated months ago. The headline read, "Local diner shut down after major health violations." I clicked on the article, my heart racing. It detailed how the diner had been closed for unsanitary conditions, expired food, and something about a rat infestation. The article even had a picture of the diner, the same diner I'd been in last night. But here's the thing. The article was dated 6 months ago. I felt a chill run down my spine. That didn't make any sense. I was just there last night. The diner was open. There were people there, customers sitting at the booths, eating, well, sort of eating. But according to this article, the place had been shut down for half a year. I called my friend Jake, who used to go to the diner with me sometimes. I asked him if he knew anything about it being closed. "Yeah, man, that place got shut down months ago," he said. "I heard it was pretty gross in there." "Why?" I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't tell him that I had just eaten there the night before, that I had seen people in there. He would think I was losing it. Hell, maybe I was. For the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I drove by the diner once, just to see it for myself. It was boarded up. The neon sign was still flickering, but the windows were covered, and there was a big closed sign on the door. I haven't been able to figure out what happened that night. Did I imagine it? Was it some kind of weird hallucination? I know what I saw, though. I know I was there. I sat in that booth. I ordered that cold, gross burger. I saw those people, sitting silently, staring at their plates. But the more I think about it, the more I wonder if they were really people. They didn't move, they didn't speak, and they barely blinked. They just sat there, like they were waiting for something. Or maybe someone. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. Whatever I saw, whatever I experienced that night, I don't want to know more. Some things are better left alone. And that diner, I'm never going near it again. I've been a trucker for over 15 years now, seen plenty of weird things on the road, but nothing prepared me for that night. It was one of those endless drives, you know, the ones where the road just keeps going and you start feeling like you're the only person left on the planet. The highway stretched out in front of me for miles, and I was deep into Nevada, driving through the desert. It was pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the dark, and I was exhausted. I decided it was time to pull over and grab a bite. I saw this little diner on the side of the road. It looked run down and lonely, the kind of place that makes you wonder if anyone even eats there anymore. The sign outside flickered, but I couldn't make out the name. The bulbs were too dim, but it was open, and I figured it would do for a quick meal. So I pulled my rig into the parking lot, which only had one other car, a beat-up old sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in years. That should have been my first sign to keep driving, but I was too tired to care. The bell above the door jingled when I walked in, and it was even quieter inside than it had been outside. There were a few booths, a counter with some old stools, and a couple of tables. The place smelled like grease and stale coffee. Behind the counter was a woman, probably in her mid-40s, wearing a stained apron and chewing gum like she had nothing better to do. She gave me a quick glance, but didn't say anything. Typical small-town diner service, I thought. I sat down at one of the booths and picked up a menu. It was sticky, and the plastic was cracked. The choices were your standard diner food: burgers, fries, sandwiches. I didn't really care what I ate at that point, so I ordered a cheeseburger and coffee. The waitress scribbled it down without a word and went back behind the counter. That's when I noticed the guy sitting by the window. He was in the corner booth, right where the light barely reached him. He was just staring out the window, completely still. I didn't hear him come in, but maybe he was already there when I arrived. He didn't look like he was eating, no plate or drink in front of him, just sitting there looking out at the dark highway. There was something about him that made me uneasy. I'm not usually one to get spooked, but he just felt off. His clothes looked old, like they were from another decade, and they were kind of dirty, like he'd been on the road for a long time. His face was pale and his eyes seemed to be fixed on something far away, but I couldn't tell what. I thought about asking him if he was okay, but I decided against it. Not my business. The waitress brought my food, and I started eating, trying not to look over at the guy, but I couldn't help myself. Every time I glanced over, he was still sitting there, motionless. After a while, he stood up and walked toward the door. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he passed my booth. His footsteps were quiet, almost too quiet for the old, creaky floor of the diner. He didn't look at me or the waitress, just walked right out the door and disappeared into the night. I expected to hear a car start or at least see headlights, but there was nothing. It was like he vanished into thin air. I finished my meal as quickly as I could, suddenly feeling like I didn't want to be there anymore. The place was giving me the creeps, and that guy, something wasn't right about him. When the waitress came back with my check, I couldn't help but ask, "Hey, who was that guy sitting over there? The one by the window?" She looked at me like I was crazy. "What guy?" "The guy who was just sitting over there," I said, pointing to the booth. "He left a few minutes ago." Her expression didn't change. She just shook her head and said, "You must be tired, hun. Ain't nobody been in here but you." Now I know what I saw. There was definitely someone sitting in that booth. I wasn't hallucinating, and I hadn't been on the road long enough to start seeing things. I stared at her for a second, trying to figure out if she was messing with me, but she looked serious. "Come on," I said. "You didn't see him leave?" She just shrugged. "Like I said, you're the only one who's been in here tonight. I paid my bill, left a tip, and got the hell out of there." I didn't even look back as I walked to my truck. The place felt wrong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to leave. As I climbed into the cab, I glanced at the old sedan parked a few spaces down. The dust on it was so thick it looked like it hadn't moved in years, but I could have sworn it wasn't there when I pulled in. My mind was racing and I was trying to make sense of everything. Maybe the guy had left on foot, but where would he go? We were in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't see anyone walking along the highway. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, keeping my eyes on the road ahead. But even as I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. The way he sat there, staring out the window, not moving. The way he just disappeared without a trace. It wasn't until a few days later that I mentioned the diner to another trucker at a rest stop. We were swapping stories and I brought it up, half expecting him to laugh it off, but instead he went pale. "You stopped at that place?" he asked, his voice low. "Yeah, why?" He shook his head. "I've heard about it. A couple of guys I know, they've stopped there too. They all say the same thing. They see people in the diner, sitting at the booths, but when they ask the waitress, she always says there's nobody there." I felt a chill run down my spine. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," he said. "Some say the people they see are... well, they're not really there. No one knows why. But it's happened enough times that guys like me just steer clear of that place now." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but the other part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong with that diner. I had seen that guy. He was real, or at least he looked real. But the more I thought about it, the more I started to question myself.